Today we have the great pleasure of meeting Professor Chauncy Harris from University of Chicago. Chauncy is an American geographer, but who has been very much involved in international organizations and promoting international understanding, doing research which helps us understand each other. It's a great pleasure that you came today, Chauncy.
Thank you.
And I'd like to begin right away and ask you where you come from and what led you first to thinking geographically.
I come originally from the mountains of the western United States, from the state of Utah. I was born in Cache Valley, which means Hidden Valley, in northern Utah. And there, as a very small child, I don't know the age, 4 or 5, I had an intense curiosity to know what was on the other side of the mountain. You go over the mountain, what on earth could be on the other side? And that is the nascent geographic interest. Later, when I was 7 years old, we moved to another valley, Utah Valley, and there, at the age of 8, I became intensely interested in the relative size of the farm villages. There were half a dozen farm villages of about 3,000 population each in what is a valley which has, in general, the highest agricultural production of any county in the Midwest, in the intermountain west of the United States. And I was fascinated why some of these villages were a little larger than others. I happened to have a world almanac with population figures, and why did one have 3,000, another only 2,000, another 4,000? And I got on my bicycle and cycled to all of these. And that curiosity in relative population sizes led me to an interest in urban geography. From the age of 8, I decided at the age of 8 I was going to be a geographer. I consulted with my father, whom I enormously admired, who was an agronomist but a college president, who had very wide interests, had a keen sense of country. I said, I'd like to be a geographer, Dad. And he said, well, fine, I'll follow it if you like. And he encouraged me. Though he himself was not a geographer, he had a great geographic interest. And I went through undergraduate work, getting as much geography as I could. There was very little in the university I attended, but I had a general liberal arts background, but with work in geology and geography. And my really professional work in geography began when I entered as a graduate student at the University of Chicago in the summer of 1933. What was that, 55 years ago.
My goodness. And 33, Chicago. Describe the atmosphere at Chicago.
It was interesting. It was intellectually stimulating, very cosmopolitan interests. The chairman of the department was Harlan Barrows, a famous historical geographer, one of the pioneers in the second generation of American geographers, the first generation of those trained in geography. Charles Colby, with whom I particularly identified. Charles Colby took an interest in me. He was interested in urban geography, and that was what I went to study. And Edith Parker, a very good teacher on methodology of teaching geography. Griffith Taylor, it's appropriate we mention him. We became very good friends there. I had 3 courses from him. And he was very different than the other geographers in Chicago, who were all Americans, and a little bit ingrown because they had all been Chicago trained. But Griffith Taylor was not Chicago trained, and he came in like a breath from Australia, a very capable person who had done extraordinary work in Australia, elevating the level of geography very markedly here. An individualist, a self-made, self-taught in a sense, but he had the careers in Australia, in the United States, and in Britain. And all of them had an influence on me, but particularly Charles Colby. Then occurred an event that had an important impact on me. I received a Rhodes Scholarship to study for 3 years in England. So in the summer of 1934, I went off to England, to Oxford. It was very, very different from Chicago. There, the emphasis was on undergraduate work, and though I already had a bachelor's degree, I did another undergraduate degree in geography, simply because that was what Oxford did best at that time. So it was very, very good for me. I thoroughly enjoyed the Oxford experience because it gave me an opportunity to write. Every week we had to write an essay. And it was individualized instruction. It got me familiar with the geography of Europe, about which I had known very little previously. I had thought maybe as a youngster, I might specialize in Latin America. When I got to Oxford, I said, I'll specialize in Western Europe. Since I had Latin and French and German and Spanish in either secondary school or university, I then thought I must go on to the continent. I spent my vacations living with French and German families to get my linguistic background and communication better. I'm no good formally in the literature of these languages, but I have learned to communicate effectively with colleagues and to read the professional literature.
I think that's the unique thing about you, Chauncy. You are multilingual, and that is not characteristic of many American
No,
geographers.
I'm apprehensive about people who are monoglots, no matter what the language, Now, English is a very important language, and perhaps as much as 40% of the world's geographical literature may be in English or accessible through English, but there's a very important 60% in many other languages, geographical publications in more than 40 languages. Now, none of us can master all of those.
Yes.
But nevertheless, I've always felt the need, and I've derived great intellectual stimulation,
Yes.
Particularly from the French and German geographical literature.
Yes. Well, you certainly, this is a later point in your career. We'll come to that, what you've done to make the other literatures available to us.
Yes.
But then you returned to Chicago?
Yes, but I spent a year at the London School of Economics before I came back to Chicago. The scholarship was good for 3 years. At Oxford, the main person that had an influence on me was J.N.L. Baker. He was very good in the history of geographical discovery, a very good tutor, an excellent person, and he later became Lord Mayor of Oxford and so on. Then at the London School of Economics, L. Dudley Stamp, Rodwell Jones, Hilda Ormsby, Gordon East, S.W. Wooldridge. It was a real galaxy of stars, and very different, but all stimulating, and that was another, because Oxford contrasted with the London School of Economics very, very sharply.
Yes.
And the British schools were very sharply different than the Americans. My vacations in France and Germany were very different than the British, so I began to have the basis for some understanding of other people, and that has been with me, I think, all my life. It comes easily, it comes naturally, because I'm interested in it.
Yes.
Then I returned to Chicago and really began my further graduate training for research in geography, and have pursued particularly the field of urban geography. And the first important article I did may illustrate with serendipity. Gladys Wrigley, the great editor of the Geographical Review, wrote an article on serendipity.
Yes.
And I wondered about the increase in population of cities between 1930 and 40 in the United States, and I thought I ought to do a little article on the growth of cities between 30 and 40. I thought, certainly the function that the cities have would play some role. So I tried to devise a classification of the cities. Well, ultimately, the original growth of cities was a minor article, but the part that I had not anticipated ahead of time became the central part, and I wrote a functional classification of the United States cities. That played an important role because I immediately presented that paper at the Association of American Geographers, and it was very well received. Richard Hartshorne, among others, rose to praise the article, and that was very satisfying to a young pup who was just starting. And they voted me in as a member of the Association of American Geographers.
One had to vote.
In 2 years. So that I got in at a very young age in the association. And that played an important role because I was in before the war was over. And then during the Second World War, I went to Washington in the Department of State. And at that time I became interested in the Soviet Union because I didn't know Russian, but I just saw that was an important country and I didn't mind languages, so I decided to learn Russian and work on the Soviet Union. Immediately after the war, there was a very bitter conflict in the United States between some members of the Association of American Geographers, which was in a sense an elitist organization because they'd been organized in order to emphasize the scientific standing of geography, to establish geography as a university discipline, as a research discipline. So they emphasized research and only admitted as members people who had made substantial published postdoctoral research to geography, which meant the membership was very small. There had grown up during the war a second group, the Association of Professional Geographers, American Society for Professional Geographers, who had the democratic ideals, but perhaps not so much interested in standards. How to bring the two groups together. And the association wanted to realize the changes that we're taking. They made me secretary at a very young age, and then I was the chairman of this committee to work out a deal. And I think it's one of the most important contributions I ever made to geography was to unify American geography into a single organization.
So you're the one that was instrumental in that. That was a major breakthrough, I think.
Well, I think I was probably the key figure, but there were lots of other people who saw the need and helped, and we had a good committee. We worked hard on it, and we were eventually successful.
That was a great preparing ground for your next.
Well, and that led me I continued on, of course, research. That's a matter of the record. But I also got into geographical organizations that way, into the Association of American Geographers, and I thoroughly enjoyed my period as secretary. I was very busy. I worked very hard at it. But at that time, I knew virtually every member of the Association of American Geographers at that time, but there were only about 250 of them. And some of the founding members of the association from 1904 were still members. And it was a rare privilege to have known some of those early figures.
Yes.
Ellsworth Huntington, Wallace W. Atwood, Harlan H. Barrows, of course, Mark Jefferson, and Isaiah Bowman. Now, I have to stop here and pay a tribute to an individual who has written biographies of Mark Jefferson and Isaiah Bowman, and of, well, of the three of them, all of whom came out of Ypsilanti. No, not Isaiah, sorry. Ellsworth Huntington didn't come out of Ypsilanti, but Isaiah Bowman came from a student from Ypsilanti, where he'd been a student of Mark Jefferson. And the biography of them has now been well covered by Jeffrey
Martin.
Thank you very much. I knew you could help me out. I can't remember the names. But, you know, we're in the conference and we're all full of others. Well, Jeffrey Martin has written biographies of these three figures, and I think it's important that people pay attention to the lives and motivations and interests and developments and contributions. I have a very strong sense of identification with geographers and geography, and think that we must make our inheritance well known.
Yes, yes, yes.
From the Association of American Geographers, I came to be into the International Geographical Union.
Yes.
And there I think the key person, well, there are two key figures that brought me in the International Geographical Union, George Cressy from the United States and Dudley Stamp from
LSE.
From LSE. And I'd been at the meeting of the International Geographic Congress in Lisbon in '49, and they'd put me on the Committee on Commissions. So I'd worked on that, deciding what direction the IGU would take. Then in '52, I was on the Arrangements Committee for the '52 Congress in Washington, and had actually worked out the distribution for the first circular for announcements, because interested in geographers from all the countries, and that was very good. Then they put me as the Vice President of the International Geographical Union in '56. And I served in that '56 to '64. Wonderful experience with lots of very good people.
Yes, tremendous. But was it always the desire to go to see what was beyond the mountain?
Well,
that led you from one scene to another.
Yes, even beyond the discipline, but primarily in the discipline because of that strong identification, but always curious about other countries and beyond. And that led on. Then the next International Geographical Congress was in Stockholm. Now, that was a very important Congress, two respects. One, Torsten Hägerstrand ran the very seminal symposium on urban geography. I had a lot of fun with that because I had my camera, and I took the pictures of each of the speakers and participants. Later on, I reproduced that and distributed it around, and they're the famous people in urban geography, but there were some of the ones that are no longer with us, like Georges Chabot from France,
Tulip.
Omé Tulip.
Edgar Kant.
Edgar Kant. And from Germany, of course, the Central Places.
Yes.
And so on, so that we then there were three very important innovations in that Congress, and I don't think this has ever been put into the record, so why don't I say something about
Please
it right
do.
now?
Yes. Yeah.
And these are the contribution of Hans W. Ullmann, a remarkable person,
Yes.
diplomatic. Well, he was a diplomat. He was the ambassador from Sweden to Norway. He had done a pioneer work in the initial paper that he wrote on Norway in the first issue of Geografiska Annaler. And he was president of the International Geographical Union. And the three innovations which he made: first, he simplified the language problem by asking the executive committee to suggest that they only use the official languages of the IGU instead of the 6 languages that had been used at Brazil and had resulted in a good deal of difficulty of communication. Secondly, he instituted having meetings of commissions and symposia and working groups separate from the Congress at a different place for an extended period of a week or so. And these have been one of the most successful innovations in the IGU. And third, he said, we do not have the resources to publish the full text of all of the papers, so people should publish their paper elsewhere. We will publish the abstracts, because both of the previous Congresses had more than 5 years, from 3 to 5 years of delay in the publication, and by that time the authors and the audience had lost interest to some degree in them. Then we went on from there to London, which was a very good Congress in '64, and then to New Delhi in '68, then to 72 Montreal or Montreal, and then 76 in Moscow, 80 in Tokyo, 84 in Paris, and 88 in Sydney. All have been very interesting congresses, and it's been a great pleasure to have been associated with each of them.
Yes, indeed. That means you've been at most of the congresses since 1949.
I've been at all since
All of them.
'49. For the full length of the Congress,
That's
yes.
amazing.
And have participated actively, but I've enjoyed Sydney the most because I haven't had any administrative responsibilities here, and I've thoroughly enjoyed going to the papers and the extraordinarily good plenary sessions which have been arranged by the Australian. And that's one of the problems of geography. We tend to get too compartmentalized, too divided into very specialized papers. How do we recapture the papers of general interest? And they've done that, I think, as successfully in Sydney as in any of the other congresses that I have been
And in
at.
that respect, Chauncy, I'd really like you to share your reflections on whether, in fact, that Ullmann innovation of having pre-Congress symposia, which are where everything happens, to have those separate from the main Congress.
Well, the advantage of it is that you have a small group with sustained attention to an individual topic. So it's very efficient. And I myself have enjoyed it. I've just been in Melbourne, and there were the 3 groups together. Now, there were, I think, maybe 140 there, which is unusual because they had 3 groups simultaneously. But usually it's been a group of 40 or 50. And they're people that are all interested in the same topic, and they're all together, so there's not much noise in the system. It's all straight communication at a very high level. So I think it's been successful. But there is a cost, because it tends to separate it from the main Congress, but you do have the specialized section meetings at the main Congress. So on the whole, I rate it as a highly positive innovation. Well, so that takes us into institutional organizations. I have worked in urban geography. I've also been very much interested in regional geography. I've got interested in the Soviet Union, and of course learned Russian, and have done a number of articles, and have edited some translated works and made various contributions. But the interesting problem has come up recently. The founder of Soviet Geography, the Journal of Translations, Theodore Shabad, who has run it for since 1960 up till 1987, almost single-handedly, a very great contribution indeed. Died of a heart attack in a taxi in New York, and rather than let the journal go down the hill, I agreed to take on the acting editorship of it, and have been doing that during the last year. He left behind him manuscript notes on 5,000 Soviet geographers on 3x5 slips. Wow. And I thought we could just sort of print them, but they said no. So I went through each of the 5,000 and selected which ones to include in a directory of Soviet geographers. And since it was most efficient to look at the biographical data, some in English and some in Russian, to immediately put it into the word processor in the form for the directory. I personally wrote it all out, and it's now been published in Soviet Geography with the biographies of more than 2,000 Soviet geographers.
That's a major contribution. My
Well, I
goodness.
enjoyed doing it because I had known many of the people, and to my great astonishment, I found that 140 Soviet geographers whom I knew personally and had met had died. 140, and many of them there was no other information on. They were sort of lost in the woodwork, and so I dedicated to these 140 geographers. Now I had had an unusual opportunity to meet Soviet geographers because I first went there in 1957, and at that year I was the vice president of the International Geographical Union and the president of the Association of American Geographers. So they introduced me to the key geographers in Leningrad and Moscow and Kiev and other places. Then I was invited back several times later, and I met the key older generation, nearly all of whom are now gone. So that's a great treasure for me of having met them and have known them in their great diversity. We think of sometimes foreign geographers all being similar, but they have that. Every country has a rich diversity of personalities, of contributors, of specialists, and so on. And that has led me into an interest a bit in biography and also in bibliography, and I've done a good deal in bibliography in terms of keeping track of what people are doing in various countries, particularly on geographical periodicals,
Yes,
but general
that was
bibliography.
That was a major contribution, the journals project.
But I'd like to pay a tribute here to a person, Emil Meinen, who has done a lot of work, and he's done the Orbis Geographicus, that which I have used continuously in 1960. And it has about 6,000 or 7,000 geographers of the world with biographical information. It's a treasure. Now that's being continued. This is the one that's just being produced here in the present Congress by Professor Ehlers from Bonn, Eckhart Ehlers. And so I'm glad it's continuing. But it is also very important not just to have the bare bones of biographical information, but also to have interpretation and fuller ones. And there I want to pay a tribute to Freeman, who has done the geographers, the bibliographies. He's edited those carefully. He's done a lot of work on it, and he just departed. And
be hard to
I think we
replace.
have to remember the important contribution which he has made on that.
Absolutely. You knew Walter, yes?
Oh, yes, yes. In fact, I was with him just before he died. I was in London, and on a happy occasion went to Oxford, and there we were at dinner with him. And so I was pleased to have seen him in good spirits and making his active contribution. But I have been highly privileged to have known many prominent geographers and many ordinary geographers like me who just go on doing their own work, but that sense of association with geography has always brought me great satisfaction. Now, I'm afraid I have to go to a committee meeting right now.
Right now.
So I'm going to have to say goodbye.
Yes, well, thank you, Chauncy. I'd like to simply ask you for what your vision is for the IGU in the future. You who have been such a true believer in the power of organizations to bring about international cooperation.
Well, one of the great contributions of the IGU, and it's specifically geographical, is it has a very large number of member countries, more than any other scientific union. And that's because geographic information is place-specific. So that if a Bulgarian writes something on Bulgaria in Bulgarian, it is of interest to geographers because it may be the best study on Bulgaria. Now, in many fields, mathematics, they don't care whether it's in Bulgaria or Hungary or Finland. It's all the same to them. But for geographers, that's why geographers need to know languages and need to pay attention to each other. And I see the International Geographical Union as a key forum in bringing the geographers together. You can't imagine how wonderful it is to see all of my old friends in the International Geographical Congress. That happy look of recognition when we recognize each other, the joy of seeing one another again, and of meeting many new people whose name you've read the literature, you know the name, and then you suddenly see the face. And you see the personality shining through and the individuality, and you're just pleased to see that personal contact.
Yes, Yes. Well, you have done more than most of us to make that possible, Chauncy. Thank you very much for coming today and sharing your story with us.
Thank you for letting me be here.
Good.